We all need to make decisions every day. Some of them are trivial, and some are life-changing. The philosopher Yeshayahu Leibovich once said that the most important decision in a man's life is whom to marry. How can we make those decisions better? What is better, and how can we incorporate risk into our decisions? A science that enables us to make better decisions will be good in our personal life, but also in the bigger scale, as a community, country, nation, and maybe even the entire world. My guest today is a world expert on risk. His name is Baruch Fischhoff, or as we say in Hebrew, Baruch Fischhoff. He's a professor of engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. He is the author of many books, including the great book, Risk, a very short introduction, which you can see right now. He is also an expert on science communication, and we will figure out what exactly is science communication in the upcoming conversation. And this is very important. When I asked David Spiegelalter, who came to the show, who should I invite next to the show, he said, without a doubt, Baruch Fischhoff. And he also added that much of what he knows is due to the research of Baruch. So, without further ado, please welcome Professor Baruch Fischhoff. Baruch, how are you?
Fine. I think that's very generous of David and very generous of you to have me.
This is a very nice introduction, and from now we're just going down uphill, I hope. So, have you ever been in Israel before?
Yeah, I lived in Israel from 1967 to 1974.
And you worked in in Hebrew University?
No, I was in a youth movement that encouraged people to go live in a kibbutz. So I did that for 3 years, and then my wife realized first that that wasn't our lives, and we moved to Jerusalem. And there I was fortunate enough to have Amos Tversky take me on as a student.
So you were a student of Amos?
Yeah, I was a student of Amos actually before he and Donnie began their collaboration.
So before we start, I had Danny speaking about Amos, and I had Richard Nisbet on the show speaking about Amos. So can you please give me another Amos Tversky story? Because many people said that he was the smartest man that they ever encountered. So can you please give me like one anecdotal story about Amos?
I'm one of the few people to have taught Amos anything. I taught him how to play squash at the Hebrew University courts, and it didn't take long for him to be better than me.
Wow.
And something great. I took away from Amos was that it's important to have hypotheses that are clear enough to be wrong, and then to be willing to admit it.
Oh, so I think that this is what we are going to speak about. But, you know, if you are an expert on decision making and you decided to move outside Israel, what does it mean about us? We will cover it in depth later on. Okay, so
well, as Yeshayahu Leibovich said, it depends on who you marry. Your marriage is a big decision. My wife and I have been together for a very long time. We met at summer camp, and this was a joint decision. So.
Okay, this is great. There is another quote by Frank Kishon. I don't know if you're familiar with the name. Yes, he was a very famous Israeli author, and he once said about long-term marriage. And he said, long-term marriage are impossible, but sometimes mistakes happen. So this was a Frank Kishon. Okay, now let's start. You're an expert of science communication and the theory of risk. And it seems that risk is part of science communication, and this in turn is part of the big field of what we call decision making. So how do you organize those subjects in a Venn diagram, which inside which?
So my research looks at how risks are analyzed. Risks, the outcomes of decisions are analyzed in ways that can inform individual or public policy decisions. And then how people absorb that information, and closing the loop, how people tell experts what information they need.
Okay.
So that's actually I'm not fond of any of the idea of a theory of risk. I think our risks, that the decisions that each of us face, have many risks, many costs, many benefits, many constraints. I think that our decisions can be informed by the work of scientists who are pursuing various theories, but in the end, they're for us to synthesize.
And would you say that nowadays there is like a general accepted theory of decision making? Which one is better? Let me just quote from your book. This decision theory looks at choices from three completely complementary perspectives. One is the logical, the second is the descriptive, and the third one is perspective. Would you say that this is like nowadays decision theory is a common knowledge about around all the experts who involved in this?
So again, I wouldn't say that it's a theory. It's more of a framework that if one wants to understand decisions, one analyzes them, trying to find out what the best information is. One talks to people to figure out what they know, what they don't know, what they want. One tries to help them. And then if that doesn't work, one cycles through it again. And, oh, maybe you didn't understand the decision. Maybe you didn't understand the people. And there are people who, yeah, so that it's that cycle. It's really more of a framework. I think most people would accept the general framework, and they would perhaps disagree on the methods for using it, or disagree on just how far it goes. That is, it's a very cognitive, analytical, thought-driven perspective. And at some point in many decisions, we want to be driven by our hearts and not just by our minds.
And I think that, you know, in your book, in your risk, a very short introduction, you start with very simple examples and then you move on to more complex examples, because it seems on its face that decision making can be almost perfect with absolute knowledge. And the idea of decision making is how we make good decision with partial knowledge. But the idea of risk is, again, it seems on its face that risk is I don't know to compute the probability of option A and option B. But if you look deeper into the meaning of risk, you see a different thing. So could you please define what, in your opinion, is risk?
Well, I guess a general definition of risk would be what's the probability of something happening, bad or good, and how much do you care about it, bad or good. And we make those decisions all the time. They have uncertainty. If we don't know, if somebody can calculate the risks as a roulette wheel, if somebody can't calculate it, then we call it uncertainty. But we make those kind of decisions. You know, what's really challenging is actually complexity. Is there are just too many things to consider when we're trying to figure what the risks are or trying to figure out what we want. And so that's really the challenge, is really complexity. And there's one of the heroes in decision making, Herbert Simon, was a polymath at Carnegie Mellon long ago, said that there are two ways of dealing with complexity. One he called bounded rationality, which is you try to get the absolute right decision while ignoring many things. And the other is satisficing, where you try to do the best you can, potentially taking everything into consideration. So the science that we all practice is a form of bounded rationality. Psychologists ignore some issues, economists ignore other issues, statisticians ignore others.
I just read yesterday The Science of Artificial by Herbert Simon. He was really a genius in the field, and again, bounded rationality is again a wonderful notion. But when people consider risk, I can look, and you present, I think, 3 or 4 different categories of risk. One can say, okay, I'm looking on the probabilities, and one can say I'm looking on the expected values. This is not a probability. And one, like Daniel Bernoulli said, I can look on the utility. Okay. And when the average Joe say that he wants to that he wants to incorporate risk into his decisions, would he say like there is a probability, expected value, or utility? Which one he will go, or different people will go with different routes?
So I would say that we're all average Joes and Josephines outside of our narrow areas of expertise, and even there, as scientists, we're taking gambles all the time. You would always want to consider the probability, and utility is a way of taking anything into consideration, whereas value is just the monetary outcomes. And it took centuries for people, very smart people, to figure out these distinctions. So I think one would always want to go with expected utility, recognizing that whatever matters to you is legitimate, even if it's not money, and even if it can't be monetized, expressed in dollar, lira, euro terms.
And so, okay, so before we dive into utility, I think that we need to spend 2 minutes on expected value. The idea is that you have probability and probability for, I don't know, game A and game B. And the problem is that some of those examples are very trivial, very simple, very naive. And when you go into the real world, when you transform those examples to the real world, something doesn't click right. But again, you have the probability, and there is a probability that you know that you will, let's say a very simple example, that the probability to get hit by a car accident is much bigger than the probability of die during a plane crash or terror attack in Israel. Therefore, we need to invest more money in eliminating car accident than in terror attacks. So this will be a very simple, naive way of thinking, okay? Mm-hmm. But as David said it, and David is like an advocate of probability in the public affair of Great Britain, said it doesn't work like this, okay? So it doesn't work like this because people treat differently terror attack and car accident for various reasons. So what can we do? What's your take on this? Because it seems that probability doesn't give us sufficient answer to what worries the public, what worries the general public.
Yeah. So I mean, all science involves professional judgments or scientific judgments and value judgments. And the value judgments come in when one defines the issue. So if one thinks about the difference between auto accidents and terrorist attacks, one could say, all I care about is the deaths. And I don't care about how much people worry about them. So I'm on the second floor of our house in Pittsburgh now. I don't know, there's probably some probability of a terror attack. There is a very little chance of an auto accident now. Whereas if one lives in a place where there is terror, as there's often been in Israel and is potentially in the United States, that concern is always with you. And if you don't know where the terrorists are going to attack next and how they're going to do it, and it seems like a reasonable, seems like it's a possibility, then you have some utility for that worry. And so if I was going to calculate the risk of terror, I would need to include, I would need to consider the probability of dying, the probability of injury, and often horrific injuries, the probability of worrying, the feeling of responsibility for children that you're sending to school. So all of those things are relevant, are potentially relevant. Worry, morbidity, mortality, regret, responsibility for auto accidents, but they tend to be less important.
And in chapter 2,
yes. There are people who may there's often a rush to judgment of the public and saying, oh, these are my statistics. People's judgments are inconsistent with those statistics. There must be something wrong with it, with the people. And in that threefold framework that you mentioned earlier, we always start with the analysis. We say, well, what is it that people are concerned about? And then I get the statistics that are relevant to their concerns. And then when I go to find out people's probabilities, people's perceptions, I ask them about all of those things. And if people don't know some of them, I say, well, why don't they know them? Is that because they couldn't understand it, or they didn't get the information from a credible source?
But now you just, you know, in the back door, you insert another very important aspect, which is value. For example, in chapter 2 of your risk book, in defining risk, you say that if you look at the top 5 death causes in the United States, you have heart disease, cancer, stroke, chronic lower respiratory diseases, and accidents. Now, if you want to just eliminate or reduce number of deaths, you need to focus on the first 4. But the first 4 are mainly correlated with old people. But number 5, accident, are much more correlated with younger people. Therefore, you say, I can look at this problem differently and say, I don't want to reduce death cases. I want to reduce, expected life years lost. Okay, if a man dies at 20, he had like another 60 years of expected life. And this transform from reduced death to reduce expected life is a value thing, is not a scientific thing. And in risk management, in decision making, you need to incorporate those values into the math. And this is a very challenging thing to do.
Yeah, no, you said that perfectly. Yeah, I think so part of our work has been to reveal these hidden value assumptions in the way the work is done by statisticians, risk analysts. They're doing their work conscientiously, but there are conventions in some places where you look at expected lives lost, and conventions in other places where you look for expected life years lost. And those, I would argue, are not decisions that scientists should be making, but society should be making, because that determines who we protect. I could add another thing there. All of those measures are just the numerator of the risk denominator. So what if you have risks that are disproportionate? So you're only interested in deaths, but they're disproportionately concentrated in a particular population. So in the United States, we have very few coal miners, but they have a very high incidence of accidental deaths and deaths from black lung disease. If you only looked at the total number of deaths from black lung disease, you would ignore the coal miners. Whereas if you look at the distribution, if you looked at deaths per hour of exposure, you would change your calculus.
Now, let me ask you about this very answer that you gave me, because in chapter 1 of your book, in Sex Education, you present a very interesting scenario where I encountered, as a religious Jew, I encountered in Israel. And the idea is, should we present or should we teach about sex education in religious schools? And the idea is very simple. So the pro side is that if you do something, please do it in a safe way. Use condoms and just get out of sexually transmitted disease. So you can know how to protect yourself if you have proper sex education. But in religious life, where we cherish values like chastity and all those things, we said, wait a minute, if I present in school sex education, it means that I give you permission or ethical permission to do those things that I, as a society, say they are wrong, okay? And this is, and it seems to me, or maybe I didn't understand, I misunderstood what you wrote, that you were in one side of, yes, do sex education. But again, this also values, you said just present the data, but presenting the data in this context brings certain values to the tables that some groups don't want to take.
Yeah. So I should check our writing after we're finished talking, but our goal was to present this as the choice that one needs to make, that there are, in a later chapter, we talk about sacred values. There are things that you are not willing to trade off. And those are, part of many, perhaps all of our lives, some of them in religion, some in philosophy, some in personal morals. So I would have hoped that we said that we presented this as a choice that somebody needs to make, but recognizing that if you recognize the sacred value, you're not recognizing the potential risk reduction, and that if you're looking at safer sex, whereas if you're emphasizing safer sex, you may be violating these sacred values for some of your students, for some of their families, and changing societal norms.
Okay.
Our goal has been to just let's bring those issues out. They're not for scientists to decide, they're for society to decide.
Okay, which brings me, I think, can you hear me properly?
Pardon?
Can you hear me properly?
Yeah, I have no problem.
Okay, great. Okay, now which brings me to another concept about science communication. You had a great book about the science of science communication. And before I dive into the questions, because I think they're strongly correlated with values and how scientists transmit or transform their knowledge to the general public, what's your definition of science communication or the science of science communication?
So there are several things that go under science communication. There is science education, which we get in schools and provides the foundation for everything we do. There's informal science education that you get on hikes and in science museums and aquaria. And then there's the science communication for explaining particular science. And then there's science communication for trying to inform particular decisions. And the former is about the scientist, which tell me about your work. I hope that we'll see if people find it interesting, what's your discovery process. And the second kind of science communication is about the audience. I say, well, I'm only interested in your work if it can help me. I've got a psychological problem. You're not the expert in my field, but what do your colleagues know about this? So I think there's been a gradual change in. So it's confusing to have two different things with the same name. There's been some shift, at least in professional circles, towards calling the second one risk communication. That I want to give you the facts that are relevant to your decision. It might be about risks and benefits and costs, but risk communication is becoming a term of art. And we need them all.
So let's go to a concrete example in the COVID pandemic. For example, we wanted, to vaccine everyone. The vaccine was is a very important procedure. It's a very important procedure in the COVID pandemic. And we wanted to convey the message of the importance of the vaccine to the general public. Given that there are many fake news and people say, no, the government is going to regulate you and inject like computer chips into the vaccine and all sort of things. And you said, just a second, I, as the Ministry of Health, gave you like graphs and said, listen, the vaccine is very important. And I'm not familiar with, I forgot the name of the company, of the vaccine company. Very fair. But I didn't convey the audience. I didn't convey the public. And many people didn't get the vaccine, at least in Israel, and of course in the US, but Israel was a case study, was a very good case study. And then you don't need to say, oh, the people are stupid. You need to say, wait, in some point, I didn't convey the message properly. And this is what you do, or part of what you do is to tell people, listen, you didn't convey the message. You can't just like email many PDFs of research to the general public. It doesn't go like this. You need a different approach. Is it correct?
Exactly. In the summer of 2020, I was on a committee of our national academies on equitable allocation of vaccine. This was before there was any vaccine. And I think we came up with a very nice model. So we said one needs a firewall between risk communication, which is giving people the facts that they need so they can make informed personal decisions and evaluate the policies, and health promotion, which is telling them what public health authorities think that they should do. It's a bit like you go to the doctor and you want to know what the facts are, but you would also want to know what the doctor thinks that you should do. But you need a firewall between them, because if you mix the two, then I don't trust your facts, because I think you're spinning the facts. So we said we needed both of those functions, and the risk communication function needed a combination of top-down communication. The Centers for Disease Control or the Food and Drug Administration needed to gather the evidence and have prototype communications. But then the actual communications needed to be given over to trusted intermediaries, local doctors, school nurses associations, historical Black colleges and university, who would tailor the message and then tell headquarters, tell CDC or FDA, this is what people are saying. And we just didn't do that. We just went directly to the promotion without providing the information. In fact, we're still not providing the information.
Let's say that people are saying that the vaccine is going, that inside the vaccine there is a little tiny chip that is going to control and regulate their behaviors and record everything. What can we do differently? Because this is so far-fetched that we can almost have nothing to do. It's like a giant unicorn will come and eat you. What can we do? Let's say that this is like this, why many people didn't want to get vaccine, because they're afraid that the vaccine is going to hurt them, that there are no, that there is a chip and I heard two different approaches to not get vaccine. One is like the chip, the government chip, and the other is that the vaccine is going to hurt you in the long run, okay? So one is, I really don't know how to handle it, but the other, I think, is pretty legitimate concern, no? What can we do?
So I don't think we have I don't think you can succeed just by countering misinformation. You have to provide good information. And we haven't done that. There is no trustworthy place where you can go and find clear, easily accessible, clearly presented information about the evidence regarding the strengths and weaknesses, risks and benefits of the drug. What do we know about the vaccine? What do we know and what we don't know? So the failure to provide that information proactively opened the door to the skeptics, eroded the confidence in the public health authorities, because, well, why aren't they telling us? Also opened the door to the people who actually don't care about health but are using the vaccines for political purposes. So I mean, it's easy to blame the public. It's easy to blame the mischief makers, but I would first do your own job right. And the public health authorities, certainly in this country, are still not doing their job. And so, it's not that you can't do that. We have colleagues at the we have colleagues at the Dartmouth Medical School, Lisa Schwartz and Steve Woloshin, who have demonstrated that you can present. They've developed a drug fact box akin to the nutrition fact box, and found that you can present fairly technical information to people in a form that that most people can understand, and that people who can't understand it have somebody who can interpret it for them. So it's not impossible, not even all that hard, to give people good information, but you have to view that as a mission, and you have to trust the public. And our authorities, I think they don't trust the public, and they certainly haven't fulfilled the mission.
I think that I had two questions, but I think that you already answered one question. One question was regarding the general public intelligence, that half of the people are below average IQ, and some of the things that are so transparent, so trivial. So how can anyone think differently that your thinking process produce are just inconceivable for a lower IQ person. And many times when we try to convey messages, just don't do it. It's against your will. It's against, I don't know, just quit smoking. And many times we don't understand the different people regarding intelligence. And I had like many conversations on this channel regarding the science of intelligence, that we need to communicate things in a different way. But you just answered and said, listen, there is a way to communicate even complex things in a simple way. And this is part of what we need to do as part of our job, is to convey this message in simple terms.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I'm grateful for what you're doing. It's part of, science communication lays the foundations for people to understand where specific evidence comes from. And it's part of my job in risk communication to figure out, first of all, do the analysis, figure out what are the few things that people most need and want to know, and then figure out how to make things that might be unintuitive, meaningful, and present them in a respectful way. An important part of my work is to test everything that we do. And it is remarkable how few messages are tested in any way, from public health authorities, from scientists. They decide, experts decide what people need to know, how to say it, what makes sense to them, and then they just put it out and then fault their audience.
But now I have another question, and I think this question is much more important. You said that that scientist doesn't trust the public or the general public, but we can go the other way around. We can say that sometimes the public, the general public, doesn't trust scientists. And this is because that many people or many scientists present their own views, beliefs, and opinion as scientific results. So we have the science, and they add some extra. You can say it with Yuval Noah Harari. You can see it with Neil deGrasse Tyson, which is a great scientist, but many of the things that he says as his own opinion. And you can say it most prominently with Richard Dawkins. There is like a very scientific questions about how genes behave, but this is irrelevant or orthogonal to the question of the God delusion. And when people say that scientists mistreat science and use science to promote their own ideas and beliefs and values and opinions, people don't trust the scientific community. People don't trust science because the same science told them something that beyond the scope of what science can tell us, and this is about ethics, about values, etc. What do you think?
I think that I very much agree with you that people who fashion themselves as public intellectuals and tell only half the story, tell only their half of the story, erode the commons of public goodwill that we all depend on.
And this is basically the goodwill, because the goodwill is a commodity that's getting lost because people say, I don't believe. And before the conversation, I tried to search for one scientist who was like fair enough to say, like, to just promote science. And I think that even Carl Sagan, like 20 years ago, said people are so unfamiliar with the concept of science and technology that in the upcoming future, we have like science-tocracy societies. And this is not be science, just the presenter of science. And again, the presenter of science presents just the view and put the flavor of science, of scientific, to present different things. And we saw it with values, religion, and ethics. And, even with the Roe versus Wade, you can think whatever you want about Roe versus Wade, but some of this is an ethical question, or I don't know, a law question. I don't know. And if you say, as a scientist, as a physicist, I say that Roe versus Wade is ABC, I don't know if I want to believe you when you say another thing.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we as scientists have as scientists, when we're doing science communication, should tell people how good our evidence is, what are the alternative perspectives, and then as risk communication, we should say, well, this is what I think the chances are of side effects from the COVID-19 vaccine, but I've had at most 2 years observation, so I can't really tell you the long term. And I also don't know what the rate of long COVID is for the people who get sick. It seems to be running about 10%, but we didn't put our resources into figuring out what that is. And I think that's part of the story. And if I respect you, sometimes if I respect myself, I should be candid about its limits.
Maybe people, maybe some of the scientists think that the public cannot grasp, cannot handle complex truth. Yeah, just like in the age of TikTok, you said vaccine is good, anti-vaccine is bad. There is the truth, or the reality is much more complex than good or bad. And we are afraid the scientists should deliver this complex message, but we should nevertheless.
Yeah, I mean, one of I think the truths of social psychology, as far as they go, is that people exaggerate how well they communicate. That they exaggerate how well they understand other people and how well other people understand them. And in our everyday life, we have a chance to find out if we're not working. And most scientists are teachers, so in the classroom you find out, you thought something was clear, but you see the blank faces, people lurking on their phones, nobody gets the question right on the test, and you have a chance to do that by trial and error for relatively homogeneous audiences, the people that you know, the students in your classroom. But when you talk to a broad audience and get no feedback, and you have no idea why they didn't understand, you'd rather not blame yourself. So you say, well, they're incapable of understanding.
Definitely. Now, let's move on to a book, The Psychology of Judgment and Decision Making. This is a great book. And in page 35, let me read it out loud. In 1977, Paul Slovic and Baruch Fischhoff, here you are, published a study that showed how to reduce hindsight biases when learning the results of research. Slovic and Fischhoff found that hindsight biases diminished when people stopped to consider reasons why the results might have turned out differently. Now, if for my Hebrew speaking audience, hindsight bias is הערכה בדיעבד, like what if, can? What if? So this is hindsight bias, and it seems that this 1977 paper is a very profound paper in theory of decision making. Could you please, before we come to the paper itself, how did you come up with this notion, with this idea?
So the idea of hindsight bias goes way back. It's probably in the Bible if I knew where to look. And I was a graduate student in psychology in the Hebrew University. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman were my advisors. They were starting their work on heuristics and biases, and the students were all looking for biases. I had an interest in historical judgment and knew about hindsight bias, and as my dissertation figured out a way that one could study it, different kinds of experimental ways that one could study it. And I think in my dissertation, I was unsuccessful in reducing the bias, trying various obvious things like warning people, you probably are exaggerating how much we knew. And then
just a second, before we continue, Baruch, I'm extremely sorry. Could you give me like the most famous example of hindsight bias that you know people may say, just a second, what is he talking about? So please, sure. What is the most famous example of hindsight bias?
So take us back a ways, but
I'm sorry, but we must do it because we need to convey science. This is what we're doing right now. We need to convey science.
So in 1972, then President Nixon went to China and the Soviet Union. And my friend Ruth Beit Maron, and I gave a survey to a bunch of people at the Hebrew University, including people in the Department of International Relations. And we said, what's the probability that President Nixon will meet with Chairman Mao, that President Nixon will declare the trip a success, that a variety of things about the two trips. And then we went back to them either 2 weeks or 6 months afterwards and said, this is a test of your memory. What do you think you said on the eve of each of those trips? You know,
and finally, they met. This is what, like, the idea is that they met. Yes?
That's right. Yeah. So what did you say was the probability that President Nixon met with Chairman Mao? And we also asked them if they thought he met, because not everybody followed the news. So people who thought that Nixon met with Chairman Mao remembered having given a higher probability to that event than they actually had.
This is great. Okay, so how can we reduce this hindsight bias?
So the two things that seem to work is, one is creating a record as you go along. So we're talking in mid-September. If you I follow the blogs on the war in Ukraine, and you see bloggers who are showing tweets where they predicted things would go better for Ukraine than many experts thought. So a historical record like that tells you something. They may not be showing us tweets where they predicted other things, but there was a record that captures something of their state of mind. That's why historians place such a premium on getting to archives, because they capture what people thought or were willing to say before they knew what would happen. So that's one thing that works. So if you're worried about it, keep a record and look at it coldly. And the second is try to reconstruct the uncertainty that you had before you knew what was happening. And
what do you mean by that?
Natural tendency is to make sense of whatever happens, to learn from experience, which is in some ways is good because we're learning from experience, but it's bad if we're trying to figure out, well, how much do we really know in this area?
In the Nixon Chairman Mao example, once I know that they met, I try and I start to extrapolate or to come up with reason why they should have met. Okay, they should have met, I think. I don't know if they met.
Right, Mao wouldn't have invited him if he wasn't going to meet with him. It would be a great affront, even though they didn't like the West.
But what do you mean that Fischhoff found that hindsight bias diminished when people stop to consider reason why the results might have turned out differently? Okay, but so how can I stop to consider why things has turned out differently? Because again, once things turned out differently, I must, put them in the context of my own thinking, of my own worldview. So how can I escape this hindsight bias trap?
Well, so one needs to separate the learning. We learned something about U.S.-China relationships, about Chairman Mao and so on from that, and we shouldn't ignore that knowledge, from the hindsight evaluation of saying, well, just how much did we know about U.S.-China relationships? And if we were surprised, if we gave that a low probability and it still happened, you'd say, well, maybe I didn't know as much as I thought, and maybe even now I don't know how much of that as I think, because I extracted too much information from learning that the two of them met. So it requires humility to say, well, how much did I know? And if I was really surprised, the catchphrase in the article from this is that if you have a surprise-free past, you're likely to have a surprise-full future.
This is great. Now, another paper from this book that, another of your quotes of you from this book, and you quote another person in your book, is how much people think they know. If you think that way they have easy decisions or hard decision, and how it's like the metacognition. How well do we think that we know about something? And I think that this is tremendously important, especially in our age, that we are full with Google and we are full with so much or so many fake news. Could you please elaborate on this research? Because he attributed this to you, you attributed to someone else. So
there are studies on the appropriateness of confidence going back to the first published paper was in the Australian Meteorological Review in 1906. So I hope we did a fair job of attributing it to other people. But in the mid-1970s, Sarah Lichtenstein and I did many studies of this. And the typical study asked people, give me the answer to a question. What's the probability that you're right? And when you've answered a bunch of questions, I can say, well, when Roy is 60% confidence, how often is he right? And if you're only right 50% of the time, when you're 60% confidence, you're underconfident. You don't realize how much you know. And if you're only right 80% of the time, when you're 100% confident, then you're overconfident because you think you know more than you actually do. So these are called calibration studies. There are many, many such studies. And the typical result is that if I'm more confident, I probably know more. But I exaggerate how well I can distinguish different states of confidence. And so I'm probably underconfident when I know a lot. And I'm probably overconfident when I know very little. It's called the hard, easy effect. I underestimate how much I know with easy questions because I can always think of how I might be wrong. And I overestimate how much I know with hard questions because I don't work hard enough to figure out why I might be wrong.
And maybe, but we have another effect that, you know, people who has a very little clue in a subject tend to overconfident their knowledge, but people who are expert on subject and they know, as Socrates said, that one thing I know that I don't know anything, they know how much they don't know, tend to be less confident. Yes.
Yeah. Those results are somewhat more controversial. The question, those results are somewhat controversial about people. One thing, you know, from in the science, one thing one needs to worry about is whether people are actually telling you how much they believe they know, or people are responding strategically. So if I'm an expert in psychology and you approach me as an expert in psychology, I might exaggerate how much I know as what's called a strategic response, as opposed to telling you, well, you know, the data there are controversial, but my best guess is the following.
And what's your 2 cents in the context of this research that you said that this is like a very old one? I tried, you know, as we spoke to find an example from the Bible. Didn't find yet, but I'm still looking. So what's your 2 cents regarding this research of overconfidence, underconfidence?
Yeah. So this hard, easy effect has born, you know, we were fortunate enough to find something that has stood the test of time. There's a lot of research on exactly how to measure it and what are the sources. I think one of the things that we discovered, I think is what most people would agree with this, is that if you read The Psychology of Decision-Making, you would take away the conclusion that people are overconfident all the time. And that reflects the kind of questions that we put to people. So we typically ask people how much they know about difficult questions, and those are ones where they would be typically overconfident. We don't waste their time asking them easy questions. So I think that I would say that the scientists have perhaps fallen prey of one of the biases by exaggerating the generality of the worlds that we study. We set things up so that people make mistakes. We set our studies up because we want to study the mistakes because they tell us things. And we tend to think that when all you look at are mistakes and biases, you tend to think that there are mistakes and biases everywhere.
Another thing that I want to ask you is, do you know, or what science can tell us about the process that a person goes through when he applies the metacognition, when he thinks, how much do I certain in a specific knowledge that I have? What exactly happening inside his mind when he tries to evaluate how convinced he is in a certain data.
Yeah. So if we think about it, I'm searching through my memory for things that might be relevant. There's a theory, been around for many years, which has a nice metaphor. It's called spreading activation. That is, I've got a cue and I start looking through my memory and I activate everything that's relevant to that. And I don't naturally activate everything in my memory that's irrelevant to that. So if in a way, it's an unnatural act to think about reasons why I might be wrong, because my memory naturally finds things that are related. So it takes discipline. So in my profession, in your profession, part of our professional training is to have that unnatural act of saying, well, maybe I am wrong. And it's not clear how far that generalizes. That is, psychologists,
like,
we're really critical about studies, but we may not be critical about sports.
Just a second. So when I try to think and the memory just pops up, I will be overconfident because the memory came very early. But when I need to think, where is it? And then just after a few or 5 or 10 seconds, I get the memory, I will tend to be less confident. This is what you're telling me?
Well, so what comes immediate are things that are most similar. And if there's nothing dissimilar, that's all you'll get. There's a nice result, something in psychology called the fundamental attribution error, which is a result from Richard Nisbett, who I guess you interviewed earlier, in which we tend to exaggerate the extent to which people are driven by their personalities. And that's because we typically see people in just one setting. They're our student or our partner or our teacher. And we don't know that there might be a completely different person where the power relationships are different, and so we need to think about, we need to do the unnatural act of saying, I wonder how she is in other settings. I write a lot of letters of recommendations for undergraduate students. Almost always find that they have a second life that's different than the life I know about in my in the classroom. They're accomplished, they've got hobbies, they've got interests, and I can't guess what that is, but I'm not surprised that it's there.
This is interesting because, you mentioned Amos Tversky, and there is like the famous question: a bat and a ball cost together $1.1. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does it cost? And this comes very handy, come very quickly, but this is a false answer. Many people say that the bat cost $1 and the ball cost 10 cents, but this is an incorrect answer. So sometimes the speed that the answer just pops into our mind or into our memory doesn't correlate with whether this is a true memory or whether it is a true answer.
Yeah. That's a really nice example. Shane Frederick sort of devised that and popularizes, one of our former graduate students. Yesterday, I read an obituary from I think her name was Sheila Tobias, who's one of the people who popularized the notion of math anxiety. And I think one of the many processes that go into how well people solve problems like that is one thing is how much ability they have to reason, but secondly is how much confidence they have in their ability. So people who have math anxiety may have math aptitude, but it's been suppressed by poor education, discouraged, you can't really do this, bad teaching, or whatever. And I think in how well people perform on tests like that is a combination of both their confidence in themselves and their ability to solve problems like that.
I think that Danny Kahneman said in one of his lectures that the most mental demanding tasks that you can present to an MBA student at Princeton is multiply two-digit numbers. This is like if you just examine how mentally demanding task is just by glancing on your eyelid, how how big, you cannot produce any more challenging task than multiplying two-digit numbers. So you are absolutely correct. Another question that I wanted to ask again relates to Israel, and this is what we call the idea of skin in the game. And since I didn't know what skin in the game up until 2 hours, let me explain my Hebrew speakers. Skin in the game, and by the way, skin in the game come from the Bible, not from IBM. Wikipedia is incorrect about this. It's come from the prophet, I think, Jonah. And the idea is that skin in the game is a phrase that you are involved in achieving a goal. For example, a hedge fund manager that takes share from the profit and the loss can be considered to have his own skin in the game. Therefore, his decision will be different. He will decide differently since he is personally involved. Now, I had in the context about the Israeli-Iran conflict with the nuclear weapon, I had Bruce Bueno de Mesquita on the show, and he told me something very interesting. He said that without the US intervention, modern opposition inside Iran would have delayed or even canceled the nuclear project. And we should this is what we should let the opposition in Iran do what they can do. But the US has no skin in the game regarding the Iranian-Israeli conflict because Iran is threatening Israel. And we need to act differently because we have a very big skin in the game. So how do the theory of risk, so it seems that the theory of risk must be in some sense subjective. And what do you think about this?
No, so it is subjective in the value sense that you raised earlier, the consequences for Israel and the consequences for the United States, which are consequential, that they don't know where a war would lead. The US wants to be a leader and so on. So that it has some skin in the game, but it's a different degree. So US and Israel are solving different problems. So they're defining risk differently. And I guess they have, in effect, you have an agency, what the economists would call an agency problem. Israel is acting on its own behalf, and ISIS is primarily acting on his behalf, but as a friend of Israel, is also somewhat acting on Israel's behalf. So there's this agency. There's the risk. The decision is different. The agency is different, and perhaps the motivation for solving it is different. This is a number one problem for Israel. It's one of many international problems for the US.
Because you have a paper that says about which risks are acceptable. And it seems that some risks are acceptable for, side A, but are unacceptable for side B, which leads me to the risk in different cultures. This is chapter 7 in your book. So maybe since many agents have many, and it has nothing to do with values. We don't even insert values into the equation. Just since agent 1 has this cooperation or this relationship with agent 2 or agent 3, and agent 4 has another relationship. So without even going inside the values or the ethics, this is a very important, this is even almost impossible to say risk in the global sense, in the world sense. And which leads me to, I think, to the last question. How can we incorporate risk in different cultures? And because different cultures perceive risk in a very different way.
So I guess in defense of the framework, or I would say that to the extent to which risks are, I guess I would say that the basic framework can capture the analytical aspects of risk, the things, which has both values and facts, can ask people questions about what's important to them, can distinguish in those discussions between sacred values and ones where they can make trade-off, excuse me, and then can look at look for ways to improve those decisions. So the basic perspective is there. This perspective is an individual decision-making perspective. So something that's different in cultures is how people get to it, to their decisions, whether they're arrived at collectively, whether there's a voting procedure, whether they defer to an expert. And I hope it came off in chapter 7 of the book that this is something that neither of us, John Cadvany, my co-author, and I really knew, but we needed to bookmark to say that this was beyond the extent of our knowledge. So we would one of the places where we have a lot to learn from other people.
And from your perspective, what is the most surprising truth about risk in different cultures that capture your attention? Say, wow, I didn't know that people in different cultures treat risk in a very, very different way. Because it seems like, on its face, in a society where failure is considered a shame, like in the Japanese culture, people will treat risk in a very different manner, where in societies where failure is just part of learning.
Yeah. If we distinguish how people think and what people think, I would guess that I believe that to a first approximation, how people think about risk is relatively similar. They're fundamental cognitive processes, and some things are easier than others. And how people think, what people think, that what's important to them is, I guess, as you were intimating, is some place where we need to be humble. And it's a sign of, where I've had some familiarity with the culture, I might make a guess. Where I have no familiarity, I should just recognize that I don't know and be prepared to listen.
This is great. This is great. Now, if you could just, give like one, I don't know, like if the one most important tip or the two most important tip when we are considering risk, it seems that more knowledge usually is better. Sometimes knowledge, more, I think there is a quote by Nassim Taleb that if you give a smart man information, he will be smarter. If you give a stupid man information, you just confuse him. So the idea is, what can we do? What is like the best tip for a better decision making? Would you say that this is a better information, more information, or better information?
I would say if I were to give a tip, it would be to recognize that if a decision feels hard, it probably is. And that one should recognize it may be hard because it's very complicated and the world has not sorted things in. It may be hard because people have denied you the information or the resources that you need in order to do it. So don't add the insult of regret and to don't add the insult of regret to the injury caused by being forced to make a very hard decision and sometimes getting it wrong. And then the following of what you were saying is that you talk to other people, because nobody has all the answers, and some people will, and you can't keep it all. It's hard to keep it all in your head. So bouncing ideas off of other people who are concerned about your welfare, that don't have an agency problem, we're not trying to work you, can often be helpful to realize, sometimes to find a better solution, and sometimes to realize that as big as the stakes are, it's still a gamble.
Another important thing is like the famous story from Alice in Wonderland, when she had a conversation with a cat, and she said, which way should I choose? And he said, where do you want to go? And say, I really don't know. So it doesn't matter which way you're going to choose. So in many cases, it seems that in the process of decision making, we have the data, we have the information, what we didn't define specifically beforehand. What is a goal? What is the outcome that we are willing, that we want to pursue? And sometimes just be with a clear set of goals, or the trajectories that you want to go, or the final destination, make all the other things much simpler. Would you agree?
Yeah. I've had the opportunity to do some projects the last few years with physicians in critical care medicine, and trying to help people make these very difficult decisions about themselves and their loved ones towards what might be the end of life. And one thing that they've run into is that there has been a shift in medicine in this country from the doctor knows everything to let the patient decide. And it often ends up with giving the patient with more information than they can handle and with impossible responsibility for figuring things out. And perhaps an emerging alternative is to think about, well, your job as the expert is to help people to be as rational as they want to be. So how much information can they absorb, and where do they need to be whole with themselves and their loved ones and their faith and everything.
It seems help
so that would get back to your point. The more information is not necessarily better because it presumes that the answer lies in the information.
Help people be as rational as they want to be. And it seems that this domain is much more art than science. How much they want to be. This is like a very delicate fine-tuning.
Yeah. And some of the physicians I've worked with, I would respect their tuning ability. I would respect their ear if I needed to make those decisions.
They are mensch, as we say in Yiddish.
Yes, they are.
Okay, so Professor Baruch פישהוף, thank you so much for your time, for your lifelong research, for your all the findings. You make the world a little bit better place, but just every paper and every epiphany, we understand more about the world, and this is the idea of of knowing God, so the world better. So thank you in this context. I always ask my guest two things. One, could you please point to a book that you read in the last 5 or 10 years that just or even a paper that change your perspective, cause you to think in different way?
Obviously not my books.
Okay. Yes.
I do like our risk of very short introduction, and to be honest, I very rarely finish books. I feel like from my own intellectual perspective, there's some very complicated problem I'm trying to understand, and I try to read very widely because I think I can learn from a lot of people, but not by I hope enriching my own perspective rather than adopting theirs. And I usually find a chapter worth of a book, I can get the gist of what they're saying. So.
Okay, this is great.
Not a professor who doesn't read books. So.
No, okay. And another question is, part of what we used to do in this channel is to speak about productivity, how to produce more. And I'm looking at your Google Scholar, at your number of books, and it's not just the number, it's just, the weight and how much they influence the work of the scientific community. Do you have, from your own age, and you are slightly older than me, this is what I guess, give me your best productivity tip that worked for you throughout your years of academia, throughout your years of research?
I'd like to work with other people, students, colleagues. I'm interested in finding basic research questions that are embedded in applied problems. So my office is open to people who have interesting problems, because their problems, like these end-of-life decisions, are a test for our science and a chance to do some new science.
Would you say that most of your papers are co-authored? Most of your papers,
I would say, ones that are not essays. I don't have a grand Fish-off theory that I'm trying to prove and recruit people to fill in the cells of my design. And I like writing, so I think I'm good on rewrite. So I like partnerships where somebody else is happy with putting the pieces together, and then will tolerate my heavy-handed rewrite. So that's a style that works for me. I think I was a math undergraduate, and I think I learned a turn of thought in doing math. I was like basic math, not applied math, which was to start at the beginning, think of what you defined, and then work the argument through. So this is my mindset for, I think that it works for writing scientific papers as well.
Wow, Baruch, thank you so much. I wish you like a more, I don't know how you said it, more life-saving, yes. Up many years to come, as you said in in the car accident, like many years to come, many years to come. It was a
thank you for having me, and thank
privilege.
you for really those really great questions. So I really appreciate it. Conversation.
Thank you so much.